A cowboy had to marry an old maid. She quietly stole his heart. The horse was already gone when Cooper Valdez rode into the yard at dawn, and that meant trouble had arrived before him. The fence along the north pasture was down in 3 places. Cattle scattered across the ridge like spilled seeds, and the foreman of the Lazy Spur Ranch was standing on the porch with a face that looked like he had swallowed something sour. Cooper pulled his hat low and swung off his saddle before the horse even stopped moving. He had ridden through the night from a neighboring county, called back by a telegram that said only 2 words, "Come home." Now he was home, and home looked like it was falling apart at every nail. His father, Don Edmundo Valdez, had died 6 weeks ago. The lawyer had read the will twice to make sure everyone heard it right. The ranch, the cattle, the water rights, and every acre of land that stretched from the creek to the Red Hills, all of it would pass to Cooper on one condition. He had to be married within 60 days of his father's passing. If he failed, the entire property would be sold and the money divided between 2 distant cousins who had never once set foot on the land. Cooper had 41 days left. He had no woman waiting for him. He had no plans to find one. He had spent the last 4 years riding circuit work across 3 states, taking contracts and sleeping under open sky more nights than not. The idea of a wife had never entered his thinking in any serious way. But the land was a different matter. The Lazy Spur was his grandfather's land, his father's land, the land he had grown up learning to read like a book. Every dry creek bed, every hawkwatch hill, every acre grass that went golden in October. He was not going to let it go to men who did not know its name. The foreman, an older man named Pedro Salinas, told him the situation plainly over coffee that tasted like burnt rope. There was one option left in the county that made any kind of practical sense, and Cooper was not going to like hearing it. There was a woman named Clara Del Monte who lived alone on a small property about 8 miles east. She was 36 years old, unmarried, considered by most of the county to be firmly on the shelf and perfectly comfortable there. She ran a small operation raising herbs and chickens, kept entirely to herself, and had turned down 2 marriage proposals in the past decade without a second thought. People in town called her the old maid of the arroyo, not always kindly. She was not the kind of woman that men lined up to court, but she was practical, she was honest, and she had a reputation for keeping her word once she gave it. Pedro had already spoken to her brother, who said Clara might consider a business arrangement if the terms were fair and the man was not a fool. Cooper set down his coffee cup very carefully. He rode out to her place that same afternoon without sending word ahead, because he figured if he thought about it too long, he would talk himself out of going at all. The property was smaller than he expected, but well kept. The herb garden was laid out in clean rows. The fence posts were all straight, and the chickens looked healthy. There was a dog sleeping near the gate who opened one eye and decided Cooper was not worth barking at. Clara Del Monte came around the side of the house, carrying a basket and a pair of worn leather gloves, and she stopped when she saw him at the gate. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected. She was tall and lean with dark hair pulled back and eyes the color of creek water in shade, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a problem they have already considered and mostly solved. He introduced himself. She told him she knew who he was. He asked if she had spoken with her brother. She said she had. He said he was not going to dress it up or make it something it was not. He needed to be married to keep his land. He was asking her to consider a legal arrangement. She would have her own room, her own life, her own money, and the full right to end the arrangement after 1 year if either of them chose. He would sign a paper guaranteeing her a parcel of land along the east fence line, 40 acres with good water, as payment for the year. She was quiet for long enough that he started to think she was about to send him off the property. Then she said she would think about it until morning and give him her answer then. He rode back in the morning. She was already at the gate. She said yes. She also said 3 things that were not negotiable. First, she would continue her own work, and he would not interfere with it. Second, she would be treated with full respect in front of every hand and neighbor, with no exceptions. Third, she would tell him the truth always, and she expected the same from him, without softening or evasion. He agreed to all 3 without hesitation. They were married 4 days later at the county courthouse with Pedro Salinas and Clara's brother as witnesses. It was brief and without ceremony, and afterward they drove back to the lazy spur in separate wagons. The first week was strange in a way that any collision of two solitary people is strange. They moved around each other carefully, like two cats in a new house, neither one crowding the other. She took the east bedroom and set up her drying racks in the mudroom without asking, which Cooper found he did not mind at all. She cooked on the nights she was home and made no comment on the nights she was not, leaving a plate covered on the stove. He ate whatever she left and never once complained, because it was always good. The ranch was in worse shape than he had understood from the telegram alone. 3 of the wells were pulling weak, the cattle count was down for what it should have been, and there was a water dispute with the ranch at the north, a hard-faced man named Gideon Price, who had been quietly moving the boundary markers further south every few months. Cooper spent his days in the saddle rebuilding what had slipped. He came home tired and dirty and went to sleep without much conversation. Clara said nothing about the hours he kept. She was usually up before him, and sometimes still at the table when he came in, working by lamplight on her accounts or writing in a small leather notebook. He noticed she wrote quickly and without crossing things out, which told him she thought before she committed anything to paper. He respected that without saying so. In the 3rd week, the trouble with Gideon Price escalated in a way that forced the two of them into the same conversation for the first time that mattered. Price had sent 2 of his men to pull up the original survey posts along the northern boundary and replace them with new ones set 40 feet further south. Cooper had found them doing it and had a very direct exchange of words with both men, who retreated but promised Price would be back with a lawyer. When Cooper came home that evening and explained the situation, Clara put down her pen and looked at him steadily. She said she knew where the original survey was filed, because she had helped old Don Edmundo look for it 2 years ago when Price first started pushing. She said it was at the county land office under the 2nd filing, not the 1st, which was where most people looked and where Price's lawyer would look first and come up empty. Cooper stared at her. She shrugged and said his father had been a careful man who did not trust things to stay where they were put. The next morning she rode with him to the county seat. She knew the clerk by name, found a filing in under 10 minutes, and had a certified copy in hand before the lawyer Price had hired even arrived to pull the first filing. When Price's lawyer checked the first filing and found nothing to support his client's claim, the whole challenge collapsed in an afternoon. Price was furious. Cooper rode home with the certified copy folded in his coat pocket and a feeling he could not entirely name. That evening at supper, for the first time, the conversation did not end when the plates were cleared. He asked her how she had come to know his father well enough to help him with land records. She told him that Don Edmundo had come to her twice in his last year when he was not well, looking for someone to talk to who would not worry or cry or try to change his mind about things. She said he was a man who needed to say certain things out loud to someone who would listen without flinching, and she was good at that. Cooper was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what his father had said. She said Don Edmundo had talked about the land more than anything else, and about his son, and about the hope that the son would come back and stop running before the land was gone. She said his father had been proud of him in a way he apparently never said directly, and also afraid that the silence between them had grown too wide to cross. Cooper pushed back from the table and stood up and looked out the window at the dark for a while. When he turned back, she was still at the table, watching him, not trying to fill the silence. He said he had not been there when his father died. He had been 3 states away on a contract job and got the telegram 2 days after. She said she knew that too. He said he did not know how to talk about it. She said he did not have to talk about it right then. He nodded and said good night and went to his room. But he did not go to sleep for a long time. Things shifted after that evening. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but in the way that a change in weather shifts. You notice it by the way the air feels different rather than by any single visible sign. She started asking him questions in the morning about what he was doing that day, not to manage him, but with the curiosity of someone who was genuinely interested in how a thing worked. He started telling her more than she asked, which was something he had never done with anyone. She taught him how she managed her herb business, which was more complex than it looked from the outside. She had contract with 2 apothecaries in the city, handled her own books, and was developing a 3rd variety of a medicinal plant that she thought had better cold tolerance than anything currently on the market. She explained this over supper one night with a precision and confidence that he found completely natural, and he realized he had walked into this arrangement assuming she was a quiet, limited woman who lived a quiet, limited life, and that he had been wrong about nearly everything. In the 6th week, a late storm came down from the mountains and pushed ahead of itself a wall of cold that the cattle were not ready for. Cooper was out before dawn trying to move the herd, and he came back at noon to find that Clara had already sent Pedro and the 2 younger hands out on the south road with extra blankets and feed, correctly predicting where the cattle would drift to get out of the wind. 3 calves that would have died survived because of the positions she had sent the men to. Cooper stood in the cold yard and looked at the result of her thinking, and he felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. It was more complicated than gratitude. That night, he sat down at the table while she was writing and said her name. She looked up. He told her plainly that he had come to this arrangement thinking he was doing her a favor, offered her something useful in exchange for a signature. He said he had been wrong about that, and he wanted to say so clearly. She set down her pen. He said he also wanted to say that he did not want the arrangement to end at 1 year, but that he was not going to pressure her or change the terms without her agreement. He said he was saying it because it was true, and he did not lie to her, and the truth was that he wanted her to stay. She was quiet long enough that the lamp flickered once in the draft from the window. Then she said she had already decided the same thing about 2 weeks ago, but she had been waiting to see if he would get there on his own or whether she would have to point him in the right direction. He laughed. It came out of him surprised and real, and she smiled at the sound of it, a smile that she did not try to hide or reduce. They sat at the table and talked until the lamp burned low, and for the first time in longer than he could measure, Cooper Valdez felt like a man who had arrived somewhere rather than a man who was always in between. The boundary dispute with Gideon Price went to a formal hearing 3 weeks later, and Price lost on every point. The certified copy held. The original survey was confirmed, and the 40 feet of grass and good fence line came back to the lazy spur. Price rode off without speaking and was not seen again for 2 months. Pedro Salinas shook Cooper's hand after the hearing and said Don Edmundo would have been satisfied. Cooper nodded and looked across the courthouse yard to where Clara was talking to the county clerk with the easy confidence of a woman who knew exactly where everything was filed and why it mattered. The land did not feel like a burden anymore. It felt like something he had grown back into, the way a man grows back into himself after a long time away. There was work every day, hard and specific, and grounded in the particular soil and sky of that place. There was the sound of cattle in the early morning, and the smell of the herb garden on a warm afternoon, and the lamplight in the window when he rode in after dark. And there was Clara, who told him the truth, who did not soften things that needed to be said plainly, who laughed when something was actually funny and did not laugh when it was not, who had helped his father find a paper in a courthouse filing when a lonely old man had needed someone steady beside him. He had ridden into this thinking he needed a signature and a technicality. What he found was a woman who had been quietly building a life of substance and honesty while the rest of the county had looked past her, and who had agreed to this arrangement not out of desperation, but out of a clear-eyed assessment that the terms were fair and the man was worth a year of her time. She had been right about most things from the beginning. One evening in late autumn, when the red hills had gone the color of fire and the first cold was settling into the yard at night, Cooper came in from a long day on the fence line to find supper on the table and Clara at the window watching the hills. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her for a moment. This woman who had arrived in his life as a legal necessity and had become, without any announcement or ceremony, the most important person in it. She turned and saw him standing there. She asked what he was looking at. He said he was looking at her. She turned back to the window, but he could see the corner of her mouth change. Outside, the wind moved to the grass the way it always had. The way it had when his grandfather first broke this ground and when his father rode its edges in the early light, and now when Cooper Valdez stood in his own doorway with 40 acres of his future already signed over to a woman who had quietly and completely stolen every part of his heart without once trying to. The lazy spur was his. The land was whole. The water ran in the right channels, and the fence post stood straight along the boundary that no one would move again. And in the kitchen, with the last red light of the day coming to the window, Clara Del Monte was setting 2 plates on the table with the calm and unhurried certainty of a woman who knew exactly where she belonged. Cooper hung his hat on the hook by the door and stepped quietly inside, and the old door closed behind him on a good life.